I'd always loved camping alone. The solitude, the quiet, the chance to reset my mind, all of it made the effort worthwhile. But even the most seasoned outdoorsman can't predict the things that lurk in the untouched corners of the world. This particular trip was supposed to be a treat for myself, a 5-day solo retreat in a remote section of the Pacific Northwest, miles from the nearest trailhead, the kind of place where your only company would be the whisper of the wind through the trees and the rustling of unseen wildlife. I'd planned everything meticulously, mapped out my route, checked the weather forecast, and ensured my pack had enough supplies for an emergency. The first 2 days were uneventful. I'd hiked deep into the wilderness, set up camp near a crystal-clear stream, and spent my time fishing, reading, and enjoying the sheer absence of human noise. It was idyllic until the third night. That evening, I'd built a small fire and was cooking a meal of freeze-dried stew when I first noticed something was off. The forest had grown quiet, too quiet. No insects buzzed, no birds called, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against my eardrums. I tried to brush it off. Sometimes the natural world does that, I told myself. Predators move through and everything else goes silent. It's normal. But my gut told me something else, something primal. I finished my meal quickly and doused the fire, retreating into my tent with a book and my flashlight. The silence outside was unnerving, but the familiar comfort of the tent walls made it bearable. For a while. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of crunching leaves. The sound was faint at first, like something small, a raccoon or a deer, but it grew louder, heavier, deliberate. Footsteps. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My knife was within reach, and I grabbed it instinctively, holding it tight as the footsteps circled the tent. They paused directly outside. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. No answer, just the faint rustle of movement. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, knife in one hand and flashlight in the other, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. By dawn, I was convinced it had been an animal, a bear perhaps. I told myself I was overreacting, but when I stepped outside the tent to investigate, my rationalizations fell apart. The ground around my campsite was littered with footprints, human footprints. Except they weren't quite human. They were larger than any humans I'd ever seen, with toes that ended in claw-like impressions. My blood ran cold. I wanted to leave immediately, but my campsite was a good 10-hour hike from my car. Packing up hastily, I tried to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trek back was grueling. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my nerves on edge. And then, as the sun began to set, I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Between the trees, maybe 50 yards away, something moved. Tall, impossibly thin, with arms too long for its body. Its head turned toward me, and though I couldn't make out its features, I could feel its gaze like a weight. I didn't wait to see more. I ran. The remaining miles back to my car were a blur of panic and exhaustion. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun had fully set, and the parking lot was bathed in the pale glow of moonlight. My car was the only one there. I threw my gear into the back seat and started the engine, not daring to look back. It's been months since that trip, but I still dream about it. I see the footprints, hear the deliberate crunch of leaves, and feel that oppressive gaze. I don't know what I saw out there, and I'm not sure I want to know. But one thing is certain, I'm never camping alone again. I've always been a camping enthusiast. Growing up near the forests of Oregon, I learned to respect nature and its many mysteries. So when my girlfriend Emma suggested a weekend hike in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I jumped at the chance to escape our routines and reconnect with the wild. The trail we chose was remote, winding through miles of dense, untamed wilderness. We wanted isolation, no crowds, no cell service, just the two of us in the forest. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp with the scent of pine, and the trail offered sweeping views of the rolling mountains. By late afternoon, we found a flat clearing with a perfect view of the sunset to pitch our tent. We built a fire, cooked a simple dinner, and laughed under the stars. That night, I woke to a sound. It was faint at first, like the distant snap of a branch. I listened for a moment, my groggy brain trying to convince me it was nothing. But then came another snap, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable crunch of leaves. Something was moving just outside our tent. I nudged Emma awake. "Hey, did you hear that?" She rubbed her eyes, sitting up. "What is it?" "Something's outside." She froze, listening. The sound came again, slow, deliberate footsteps circling our campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine a beam outside. The forest was still, the fire reduced to glowing embers. But the silence was heavy, suffocating, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. "Probably just a deer," I whispered, more to reassure myself than Emma. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, we found the tracks. They were huge, easily twice the size of my hand, with deep claw marks at the tips. At first, I thought they might belong to a bear, but something about the shape was wrong. The toes were too long, the stride too wide. Whatever left those tracks was big, fast, and unlike anything I'd ever seen. Emma wanted to head back immediately, but I convinced her to stick to the plan. "It's just one night," I said. "We'll be fine." She didn't argue, but I could tell she was uneasy. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed the forest was quieter than usual. The birds were gone, and the usual hum of insects had vanished. Even the wind seemed to avoid our camp. We kept the fire blazing, both of us jumpy at every sound. Around midnight, it returned. The first thing we noticed was the smell, pungent, musky, and sour, like rotting vegetation. Then came the sounds. Heavy, purposeful steps, accompanied by a low guttural growl that made my chest tighten. Emma grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What is that?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. The creature stayed just beyond the firelight, its shadow flitting between the trees. It was massive, its silhouette almost bear-like, but with a longer, leaner body. Its glowing eyes reflected the fire, staring directly at us, and then it howled, a deep, bone-rattling sound that echoed through the forest. "Into the tent!" I shouted, pulling Emma with me. We huddled together, listening as the creature circled, its growls turning into sharp, guttural barks. It clawed at the ground, tearing at the earth just outside the tent. I gripped the hunting knife I'd brought, every muscle in my body tense. Emma was trembling, whispering prayers under her breath. Hours passed, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature was gone. We didn't wait for morning. As soon as the first hint of dawn appeared, we packed our gear and started down the trail. I kept my knife in hand the entire time, scanning the trees for any sign of the beast. The hike back was grueling. Several times I caught glimpses of movement in the distance, branches swaying, shadows darting, but whatever it was never came closer. By the time we reached the car, I was drenched in sweat, my nerves frayed. Emma refused to talk about it on the drive home. She hasn't mentioned it since. I've tried to rationalize what happened, convince myself it was just a bear or some other large predator. But bears don't move like that, and they certainly don't leave tracks like the ones we saw. I've scoured forums and wildlife databases, looking for anything that matches the description of the creature we encountered. The closest I've come is a local legend about the Ridgeback, a territorial predator said to roam the deepest parts of the Blue Ridge. I don't know what it was, and honestly, I don't want to. But I do know this. The forest isn't just a place of peace and beauty. It's wild, untamed, and home to things that don't care whether we believe in them or not. And the Ridgeback, it's still out there. I've always thought of myself as a pretty brave guy. I've camped in the Rockies, swum with sharks in Mexico, even climbed Mount Rainier once. So when my friend Liam dared me to spend 3 nights alone in Black Ridge Forest, I didn't hesitate. Black Ridge had a reputation. Locals called it the forest that doesn't forget. There were stories, of course, missing hikers, strange sightings, unexplainable noises. Most of it sounded like overblown campfire tales. Still, I wasn't about to turn down a challenge. The first day passed uneventfully. I parked my truck at the edge of the trailhead and hiked deep into the forest, deliberately avoiding marked paths. I wanted to prove to Liam that I could handle myself even in the wildest terrain. By sunset, I'd set up camp near a small clearing with a creek running through it. The first night, the forest came alive with its usual symphony, chirping crickets, hooting owls, the occasional rustling in the underbrush. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds and drifting into an easy sleep. The second day was much the same. I fished in the creek, explored the surrounding area, and gathered firewood. But that night, the forest was different. It was quieter. The usual sounds of nightlife had faded to a low hum. The stillness wasn't total, but it felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a low growl. It wasn't loud, but it was close. Too close. I sat up, clutching my flashlight, and scanned the darkness beyond my tent. Probably a coyote, I muttered to myself, but something about the growl didn't sit right. It wasn't the sharp yip of a coyote or the deep rumble of a bear. It was guttural, almost deliberate. The sound didn't repeat, and eventually I convinced myself it was nothing. I drifted off again, though my sleep was uneasy. By the third day, I was on edge. Every snapped twig, every movement in the corner of my vision made my skin crawl. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. There's nothing out here that can't be explained, or so I thought. That night, everything changed. I'd built up a roaring fire to keep my nerves in check. The flames danced, casting long shadows across the trees. As I stared into the flames, I heard the growl again, low, menacing, and closer than before. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and stepped cautiously toward the edge of the clearing. "Who's there?" I called, my voice firmer than I felt. No response. Then, just as I was about to turn back to the fire, I saw it. Two glowing eyes reflecting the firelight, staring at me from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to be a coyote, and their spacing was all wrong. Wide, predatory, unnatural. "Go away!" I shouted, waving the flashlight. The eyes didn't move, and then it stepped into the light. It was a wolf, but not like any wolf I'd ever seen. Its fur was matted and patchy, revealing scars and raw patches of skin. It was massive, easily the size of a small bear, with long limbs and unnervingly human-like movements. It bared its teeth, and I noticed something else. Its mouth wasn't normal. Its jaws were too wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth that didn't belong in any natural predator. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. The wolf took a step closer, its growl deepening into something almost like a rumble of laughter. I snapped out of my paralysis, backing toward the fire. "Stay back!" I yelled, grabbing a burning stick and brandishing it like a weapon. The wolf stopped, tilting its head as if amused. For a moment, we locked eyes. Then, with a snarl, it lunged. I swung the burning stick wildly, and the flames licked its face. The creature let out a horrible guttural scream, not a howl, but something far more chilling, and retreated into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I packed my gear in record time, barely able to see through the adrenaline haze, and ran. The trek back to my truck was a blur of panic and exhaustion. I stumbled through the underbrush, falling more times than I could count, but I didn't stop. Every time I paused to catch my breath, I heard it. Those heavy footsteps, keeping pace just beyond the tree line. When I finally reached my truck, the first light of dawn was breaking. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped away, not daring to look back. It's been weeks since that night, and I haven't told anyone what happened. Not Liam, not my family, no one. But I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed me out of those woods. At night, when I close my eyes, I still see those glowing eyes staring back at me. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, I hear that low, rumbling growl. I don't think I'll ever go back to Black Ridge Forest, but sometimes I wonder, if I'd stayed one more night, would I have been its next victim?